I may move ahead with the minutes
Okay,
first.
everybody, we are recording, and now I'm admitting everybody into the room. And Doug's here. Perfect timing.
Today he is known as Amy. We'll try not to call you Amy.
Okay. So should I give the background warning?
Mhm.
Okay, so here's the warning for everyone. I just placed everybody on mute so that you are not all talking over each other. So if you need to unmute, you still have the power to do so when you're called on by the chair. And this meeting is being recorded, so everything we say will be preserved for the future. Thank you. And with that, I'll turn it over to our chairperson, Audrey Carter.
Thanks, Jeffrey. Good afternoon, everyone. We're just a minute after 4, and I want to officially call to order the October 27th meeting of the Intergovernmental Cooperation Authority for Harrisburg. All board members are present. We're still waiting for Neil, who is, I know, joining us, but was also in court today, so I'm assuming he might be just a tad delayed. We are still awaiting the appointment by Senator Costa. So once that is made, we will have a full complement. I'm going to assume that perhaps here, maybe in November and December, they may have time to address that. Our first order of business today is the electing a new secretary treasurer. Post originally held by Tina. We were going to wait until we had a full complement, but I think in the interest of time, we'd like to move forward. And I was wondering if I could ask for a nomination.
Madam Chairman, I'd like to nominate Kathy Speaker McNett as Secretary Treasurer for the organization.
Wonderful. Kathy, I'm assuming you will be willing to take this assignment on. And then could I ask for a second, please?
I would be very pleased to second the nomination.
Wonderful, thank you. All those in favor say aye.
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 Aye. All those opposed? Motion carries. Congratulations, Kathy. We only told you part of what you're in for. Next, I would like to ask for a motion to accept the minutes of our September meeting. I believe you received them. Hopefully have had a chance to review them. And could I have a motion to accept the minutes?
I'll make that motion.
A second?
Kathy.
Kathy seconded. Any discussion or questions or corrections? And if there are none, I'd like to ask for a motion to, no, I'd like to, all in favor, say.
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries, minutes accepted. Jeffrey, would you please give a report on the bills paid since our last meeting?
So I distributed a report to members. Let's see, Neil is in our waiting room. Let's get him in here. I distributed a report to the members. It shows that there were 5 transactions in the last month. Distribution for website, legal services, and IT. We started the period with a balance of $108,674.34 in our account. We have finished the period with a balance of $104,727.67 in our account, and we have interest earnings year to date of $16.71. And if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to entertain them. Otherwise, that is the finance report for this meeting.
Thanks, Jeffrey. I'm just going to make a few quick comments before we move on to our 2 speakers who have joined us for today. Since the last meeting, Neil and I have exchanged several emails, and shortly we are going to get a meeting on the calendar to address the substantive differences, because we know there's still some differences that we need to iron out. And I think we're possibly hopeful that they're just misunderstandings, that when we can sit down, we can actually speak the same language, and then we can move quickly, I hope, forward to actually focusing on the actual language and getting it adopted. The 5-year financial plan from the city is due to the ICA board on the 31st, which is Halloween and this weekend. And they are on track to deliver it. So we look forward to reviewing it. And once we receive it, the ICA, according to the act, has 30 days to review it. I personally would like to challenge us to be able to review it and try to come back with a comment at our November 18th meeting. And then thereafter, if we respond, the city has 15 days. And I will be in touch with Charlie soon just to make sure he's able to follow that sort of timeline as well, because we will look forward to his opinion, as that will certainly inform us. And while I know we're heading into an incredibly busy time as we get into the end of the year, the city's budget, everything else that's involved with that, we must not let these deadlines slip. As a reminder, the next 5-year financial plan is due April 30th of 2021, with the goal of having it fully approved by June 30th, which was the date we approved as the official, essentially permanent extension from December 31st. And then it's really important, I think, that we've started and we need to continue working together collaboratively. So we owe it to the citizenry and we owe it to the legislature. I think it would be a good signal to them to show that we are indeed moving forward. So I look forward now to moving into the meat of the business and encourage my fellow board members to participate frequently, ask any questions, and I know we're going to learn a lot. Our first speaker this evening is Marita Kelly, whom everyone knows is the dedicated Act 47 recovery coordinator for Harrisburg. I feel like we've become partners on this journey, Marita, and I appreciate your counsel, engaged conversation, and insights along the way. Marita, I'm going to turn it over to you to give a short update on your third quarter report.
Thank you, Audrey. I appreciate it. Can everyone hear me okay? Very good. Well, there's some good news. The county, through the COVID-19 County Relief Program, has provided $2.8 million to the city in assistance for police and fire primarily, but also some public works activities. So that was a very, I'm sure, a very good sign of relief for both the mayor and city council to receive that additional funding through the CARES Act. I certainly was pleased to see that happen, as our first responders have been brave and have demonstrated their desire to serve regardless of the circumstances, including a pandemic. So that's pretty impressive. So moving on to some of the financial circumstances in my third quarter report. One of the concerns I had, and I'm sure others have, is that, of course, revenues are not coming in as quickly as, of course, they should. Normally at 9/30, 3/4 of the way through the year, we should have about 70 to 75% of revenue. On September 30th, we had 55.94 of revenues, total 43 million, and a little over 43 million. And Interestingly enough, the taxes are actually pretty much on the mark. So that's a good sign because that's a big chunk of our revenue. And I do think one thing that wasn't included in the departmental revenue was the pension. I'm sorry, that might be a separate line item, but at any rate, the pension allocation from the state did come in slightly after the report. So that was a relief. And of course, that had to be paid back out to the pension plan, but that was not recorded. So that could have been one of the impactful numbers in the non-tax revenue that we saw. It was a similar situation with expenditures. Thankfully, the mayor and the business administrator has attempted as much as they could to hold the line on expenditures, at least during the first 3 quarters. That's all I can report on right now because that's what the report is for. And that was at about close to 60%, which is down from 75%. Now, obviously, the police and fire did receive hazard pay, as you would expect. That's and some public works employees. So that would have increased costs for personnel, of course, but it is concerning that we're not at the mark that we normally are for September 30th. But I just wanted to keep a watchful eye on that, and I hope that you would as well keep a watchful eye on those revenues and expenditures. I was able to review 1014s, but I can't really give you a terrific report on that because I haven't gone line by line item through all of those. But it's a little better picture, let's put it that way, for 1014 revenue and expenditures. Also, in terms of cash, obviously we're down a little bit on cash. On 9/30, we had 28.5 million general fund. But of course, we had a sizable debt service payment of 8.1 million. I outlined that for both Audrey, and it's outlined for the judge in the report and any other individuals reviewing the report. Now, I also did a review of this week's payroll, which is for tomorrow. The general fund cash balance as of 10/29/2020, once the check run and payroll is executed, will be 23.6 million. And the neighborhood services cash balance for 10/29/2020 would be 7.1 million. So just want to keep up to date on those cash balances. Obviously, this far in the year, we will start to see those going down somewhat. And then, of course, we'll see them jump back up back in February and March when the new tax revenues begin. Hopefully, it's still hard to tell what will happen in 2021, even 2022. Depending on how COVID moves. We had hoped to be in a better spot than we are right now. I think there were over 2,000 cases yesterday in Pennsylvania, which is worrisome. And we're heading into the busy flu season, but I'm not a doctor, so I won't spend much time on that particular topic. I am in the process of reviewing the 2020-21 budget, which was provided to me by the Budget Office. Thank you very much, Budget Office, for providing it on time. I am reviewing it. That's stipulated by Act 47 law. You probably know that. So I'm in the process of reviewing that. I'll have to provide my comments back somewhere around mid-November, probably the 15th, somewhere around that time, maybe the 16th. But that's pretty much my report. There's always more, and there's probably, I'll finish talking and I'll think of 3 more things, but those are the key pieces. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Any questions from anyone?
Just quickly, so to reiterate, you said both the property and income taxes have been tracking pretty closely to prior year?
Yeah, interestingly enough, they have been, and even on 1014, it was even better. So thankfully, that's very helpful. The thing we're getting smacked hard on is because of COVID and the closures, the parking revenues are
Right.
abysmal. And they're down at like 22% on 9/30. So that was just one line item. That was the priority parking. I didn't look fully at the full parking. So excuse me for not having those that exact data. But yes, the tax revenue does look good. And I've been really examining that hard as I look at the 2021 budget. So interestingly enough, that's been tracking fairly normal.
So I in conversations with some folks with Dauphin County, they had also commented that very few people took advantage of the delay in payment on the property taxes. Most adhered pretty closely to the original statutory deadlines rather than the extension into August, September.
Yeah, we're creatures of habit, aren't we? Which is a good thing.
Yeah.
Very good for Dauphin County. I know you're an advocate for county, so for
Yeah.
sure.
Thank you.
Quite welcome.
Any other questions for Marita? And I know Marita stays with us, so I think if she thinks of anything or we think of anything, she would probably allow us to call back on her.
Certainly. Thank you
Oh,
very much,
sorry,
Madam
Jeffrey.
Chair.
I don't think, Maria, I don't think you have any information on us, but if you know of anything about the deadlines for the upcoming completion of the current year fiscal budget for the Commonwealth, I assume that there's work being done on the current, but the completion of the current fiscal year budget, because we don't have a completion of the budget. So I guess at some point soon, there'll be information released as to how that will proceed.
I'd have to yield to Mr. Ryan on that. Yes, thank you.
I didn't want to put him on the spot.
It's a work in progress. So the General Assembly will be back in, I think the next scheduled date is in early November and at that point, budget discussions and budget discussions can be ongoing even before the General Assembly returns, but we wouldn't look for any formal action until that point.
Thank you, Mark.
But I think it's worth noting, though, it is a harder deadline than the July 1st deadline in a way, and that's because of November 30th sign a die adjournment of the General Assembly.
So going back to my saying that this is a hectic time coming up, at least we will all suffer together with these impending deadlines. So next on our agenda, I'm delighted to welcome Steve Goldfield, who is joining us from, I think you're in Media, PA.
Yes, that's correct.
And he serves as the principal of the principal of Municipal Advisor Solutions and a counselor at Praga Public Resource Advisory Group. I had the pleasure of meeting Steve in April of 2019 and was still a little naive. So much of what he said, I think, just blew me away. But I knew that he was instrumental in really pulling the strong plan together, specifically the forensics of how to put everything back together to a place where it needed to be. So we've, I think Marita provided a wonderful segue in introducing the fact that one of the parts where the revenue has fallen most down has been in the parking revenue. So Steve, I will turn it over to you and thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And hello to everyone on the ICA. I don't know if there's public on these meetings, but if there are, hello to you as well. Just as a preliminary observation, I was involved in the forensic investigation in 2010 and 2011 and saw how it all fell apart and became the financial advisor for the receiver charged with putting it all back together again. I can't help but mentioning that Neil and I spoke a couple days ago and he brought me back to a time in 2012 where the general fund balance at about this time of year was $40,000. And so the city, has many challenges, but we were trying to figure out how to get through the year and whether we were going to get through the next payroll back then. So I've been asked to talk a little bit about the parking transaction, and even people who have done parking revenue bonds over and over again, which was not a requirement of anyone on the ICA, would find this to be a very unconventional structure. So it's important for me to give you a glimpse of the idiosyncrasies of this structure. I don't think I've ever done a deal that had to do so much and was so complicated. And so it's not surprising that somebody that comes in and tries to look at it afterwards ask questions like, well, why did they do this? So I'm going to spend about 5 to 10 minutes tops telling you what we were faced with and trying to give you a glimpse into why things are the way they are, and then go through the flow of funds a little. And you know, we all know that parking revenue deals and airport revenue deals and all sorts of revenue deals are in terrible shape right now as a result of the COVID shutdown. So hopefully this will give you a base to now think about, okay, well, that was then, I get it. I get why you did it this way. So now what are we going to do? Okay. So there were 2 large negotiations going on at one time. The first was we had to generate enough proceeds from a parking transaction to pay off the debt that the sale of the incinerator couldn't pay off. We obviously had to pay off the parking debt. That was about $100 million. We paid off 2 bond issues that were cannibalizing parking revenues. And when I say parking revenues, in this instance, I'm referring to parking taxes and parking fines. And the city had to leverage them, borrow against them, pledge them to other bond issues to try to get out of the problems it was having. They did what was called an unfunded debt type borrowing, where you borrow for 10 years for working capital today, just to get through that year. So by the time we got involved, parking had been generating millions of dollars for the city, but it generated $250,000 the year before we got there, and it was going to generate $0.00 in the year that we came up with this plan. In addition to refinancing the parking and paying it off in the incinerator, the city hadn't paid AMBAC on its general obligation debt. That's $7-point-something million a year in a year or two. It sent shockwaves across Wall Street when Dave Unkovic, the receiver at that time, said, payroll or debt service. I got to pay payroll, and didn't pay debt service. So we cut a deal with AMBAC, the bond insurer for the city's GO bonds, that we would give them a payment out of proceeds of the parking as well. We also owed $15 to $25 million to the suburban municipal communities who had been overcharged for sewer rates for years and years, because the city was taking money to defray its general fund expenses. So we had to make an installment to them. Had to pay down accounts payable because they had gotten way too high, and we wanted to get the city to be set up in a way where you know, they were at 60 days, maybe 90 days payables. Made a deposit to the OPEB trust fund, made a deposit to Impact Harrisburg for infrastructure and economic development. Okay, so that's a lot to get out of a deal. So this wasn't how do we do the best parking deal that we can. This was, you know, how do we do this parking deal in a way where we satisfy all the creditors? And so all along, the creditors, of course, wanted to get paid back as much as possible and not take haircuts. So they were pushing us to increase the size of this, but we also knew that we wanted to get, and this is the second negotiation, revenues to the city on an annual basis, because they were going to lose the money from the suburban communities. They were, backfilling. I think about $13 million was the structural deficit when we first came in, and we had to backfill this by using a lot of different techniques. But the parking deal was the engine. It was the engine for the upfront proceeds, and the more debt that was issued, the more debt service you have to pay. The more the revenues that come in have to pay debt service, the less you have coming out for cash flow. So we needed cash flow for the city. We needed a couple $1 million. And when we finally did everything that we were doing, we figured out that we needed about $2 to $2.5 million a year of cash flow coming out of the parking deal. So one bright point, I like to do this because I'm as depressed as everybody. I haven't been into my office since March, and my backyard is my world. The city had not sold its parking assets and defeased all the parking debt, not only would you be having, these revenue problems anyway, right? But people aren't parking, but you know the debt service. The debt service was $6 million a year. So the city guaranteed a lot of the parking debt. Audrey, I just sent you something from another state capital who does still have revenue-backed deals that aren't cash flowing, and they don't know how they're going to pay it. So I just want to point out that we never, ever would have contemplated that we'd be where we are today. There's one little bright spot, which is that, at least the city's not guaranteeing the parking debt and losing the money from the revenue. So as I said, we wanted to get reoccurring cash flow. The strong plan itself was submitted on August 26th. I remember because it was the day after my birthday. My birthday was spent writing the strong plan, August of 2013. And it was before the bond issue and the transaction occurred, okay? So you've got a trust indenture and an asset purchase agreement, flow of funds, and we know all that. The strong plan was, we've got to squeeze out enough money to pay all those creditors and all those bond deals off, A. B, we need to present to the court a balanced budget for the next 4 years. And so to do that, we need a parking transaction to generate around $2 million a year. And if we get more, great. And if the parking transaction does really, really well, the people in Harrisburg are going to be mad at us because they're going to say, why did you sell our parking? Look how well it's doing. So we wanted to get a share of cash flow to the city as well, to the extent that it did well. And this was a theme throughout negotiations. I think we had 32 different creditors. The big ones were the AGM in the county, but I think we had 32 different creditors that we were negotiating. And the theme was, shared pain, and let's try to align everyone's incentives going forward, because we knew we weren't going to make everybody happy. I can tell you for a fact that AGM and the county were absolutely 100% sure that we were in the pocket of the city, doing the city's bidding and making things miserable for them. And, the city at the time said, well, you're just going to do what the creditors need. And so we had people, from Wall Street and the creditors mad at us. We had the city mad at us. We thought we must have hit it down the fairway here. This must be a sort of fair deal if, nobody's saying, this is great. Okay. And it was, very difficult, 360 million in debt we had to pay off. So we're going into negotiations of a parking deal where we have to generate a certain amount. And of course, the market moves away from us in August, September in a big way. We lose $25 million worth of proceeds that we could have had, and we need it. And we have a settlement deal that's signed that we need to hit a bogey of all those things that I said out of the parking deal, and it's not doing it anymore. Okay, so the negotiations that ensued resulted in the state providing that statewide contract, and we took the Series A bonds and squeezed them as hard as we could by saying, what if we do everything in the Series A and generate as much money as we can? Can we make up this $25 million? And we did, along with some other moves. So the first move was the Series A bonds are backed by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania contract. And the Series A bonds, and this is extraordinarily unusual. In fact, I don't know if I've ever seen this before in my 32 years, are senior to operations. That the Series A bonds get paid out of that contract before operations. And that's not common. The most common thing, and 9 times out of 10, you have to pay operations or you're not going to generate revenue. And you have to pay capital. This is a capital intensive business, parking. And we're going to get to this. Capital should not be as low down as it is, but it is, because if we put capital ahead of the debt service, we need to cover operations and capital, meaning we need revenues 125% of debt service after that. That would have dropped us $30 million. And so the creditors were arguing, you need to move capital up. You need to move capital up. We said, we know we need to move capital up. We know that's the only way we ever do it. But are you willing to take $32 million less? And they said no. Okay. So let's see. The last thing is that I want to say that the priority payments, which we're talking about today, that I'm sure aren't coming in because there's so little parking, there's probably not even enough revenue for the bonds. And so they're probably dipping into the reserve funds. The idea was, again, that the city was going to get a priority payment that was supposed to get it to about 2 to 2.5 million all in. Now, the one thing that the city gets directly are tax revenues, 20% of the parking revenues. I know that's dried up as well, but back then, with parking rates being increased and the parking revenues not being pledged any longer to those other bond issues, we thought that we could get the city from about 1.4 million up to about 3 million. So about 1.6 million of what we were trying to generate was going to just come out of the parking taxes. And I think that my contract expired in 2017 or 18 with the state, but I had been following it. And I think what I'm saying is that we were over $3.2 million a year in parking taxes, pre-COVID. And so that was working pretty well. The other part was, the collections for fines were supposed to go up. And it wasn't supposed to be that everybody got fined and you made money off of fines. It was supposed to be that the people who used to park in front of the cigar shop or the dry cleaner or the market, who just left their car there for 5 hours because nobody did enforcement, weren't going to do that anymore. Once there was enforcement, they were going to move into the garages. So we expected the garages to go up and the parking taxes to go up, and people, to no longer do that. So that's the revenue flow, the fines and the excess revenue flow that was supposed to come to the city. So I want to point out one thing that I did send to the ICA, which is an extract from the 2016 report. If you look at page 11, it says that what the receiver team negotiated was a deal that put the city in a position to benefit if the parking construct worked really well. Not happening today. The city would obtain on a priority basis and prior to certain payments by SP Plus, and then it was Tri-Mount. Now I think it's Park Harrisburg. Is that what they're calling themselves, or Park Harris? So we put the managers at risk to operations and to the city for 20% of what their contractual charges were. So if you look when we get to the flow of funds at the performance fund, we called it a performance fee. If there's enough to pay for the debt service, the operations, and all of the city payments and rent, then you get your performance fee. Again, trying to align the incentives so that they'd work harder and the city would get what it needed. So right after that sentence is in the report, it says that the receiver team told the city, these contractual provisions are not guaranteed amounts, nor shall they be used as a basis for formulating the city's budget. So the idea was that most of this revenue hopefully will come if everything goes well. Maybe all of it will come. But don't build a budget based upon the city payments and the rent. That should be, the amount that, assists in, balancing the budget at the end of the year, because some revenues are going to come in under, some, expenditures higher. We also were faced with, at that time thinking that the LST and the EIT tripling were going to have to be replaced. So we structured a lot of the debt to the suburban communities, et cetera, to fall off about when the EIT and the LST, because of the exit plan, were going to, likely fall off. The debt fell off and the revenue was supposed to, kind of grow, but it hasn't done that. So, finally, I just want to say again that typically the capital improvements would be, up higher. But it was a negotiation that, we could have said, well, we wanted higher, but we never would have closed any of the deals. So at this point, I wanted to go through the flow of funds, which I think everyone has, unless people have questions before then. I'm happy to entertain questions now, or you can interrupt me as I go through the flow of funds. Okay, so in my rudimentary schematic here, money comes into the revenue fund. And as I said, in a typical deal, it would go then into the operating fund and pay operations. But we needed to squeeze more proceeds out of the Series A bonds by making them super priority, super secure. It lowered the interest rates on the A bonds. If you look at the marketing, they had the lowest interest rates, even though we have county and AGM wraps, meaning credit enhancement or guarantees by the county and AGM of the bonds. The Series A bonds were the most sought after, had the lowest interest rates, and therefore we could take the revenue and get the most out of it. And so that's why that's sitting ahead of operations. Then the operating fund, and then you look at the Series B and Series C bonds are paid next. So they're more in line with what you would expect. Now, as I said before, the little bright spot is that the city didn't guarantee the bonds, but AGM and the county did. So to the extent that there's not enough revenue to pay for operations, which have to happen, and debt service, it's AGM and the county who are standing by to repay. So first they'll hit the reserve fund. The debt service reserve fund for the Series A bonds is separate and would be replenished first. And then this debt service reserve fund for the B and C bonds would be hit second. And those need to be replenished before you get to the city payments and the rent. So right now, during COVID, I haven't seen numbers in a couple of years, but I suspect that there's so little parking that we're not getting down to city payment and rent. But what in the ordinary course, we would pay debt service. And I think we were covering operations and debt service about 1.2 times, meaning we had 20% more revenues than we needed to pay operations and the debt service. And so that is what would flow to the city in terms of the city payment and the rent. Then once the city's paid, the performance fund, that gets back to your SP Plus and the asset manager. That's the last 20% of what they were supposed to be paid. And then there was an authority payment. The authority fee, expenses, etc., were supposed to be paid for. And then the capital reserve. After that was a holdback fund. A holdback fund was for if the city breached any of the asset purchase agreement covenants. They increased the parking tax to 35% and less people come. That's a breach. The city sets up its own parking garage. They can't do that. There's a non-compete. So in a typical deal, when I say typical deal, typical parking deal, they would call this a compensation event where the buyer would be compensated for the wrongful action of the seller, and they would have to pay it. And we said, you can't go to the city with your hand out. They don't have any money. So all you could do is, dip into surplus revenues, and you can, take them or, take them some money before you make the next city payment, et cetera. So that's pretty far down. Then there's the surplus fund. The surplus, it's not really worth talking about anymore with, the way things are, but the creditors left about $90 million on the table, and the city and the creditors were going to take the surplus cash flow over time. Now, it's not a foregone conclusion where I can't say I'm absolutely 100% sure that this is never going to kick in, because the debt does get repaid over time. And as the debt gets brought down, and maybe there'll be refinancing opportunities once things get back up and running, there may be, some possibility for cash flow. And so the city gets some back end cash flow as well. So I don't want to spend too much time talking about that, because, I feel like that's never land where we are now. Maybe you'll call me back in a year and a half after COVID's done, and we'll be back up and running, and we can, have that conversation. So I guess in conclusion, I was looking at the 2016 plan and the actuals, because that's the latest that I have on my system. And it was working pretty well, but now you're faced with, okay, that was then, this is now. So now what do we do? Right now, I'm guessing, as I said, that there's not even enough revenue to pay for the debt.
One
Yes.
thing I wanted, this could be a moment to interject, Steve, that Neil did provide us with a letter from the Department of General Services this week, where they have renewed their obligation to rent the parking spaces for the Commonwealth employees. And I know that that's an important part of the revenue scheme. So as long as DGS continues to rent those spots, whether or not there are workers to put in those parking spaces, that does provide sufficient revenue, at least to get you to a certain point.
Yes.
I'm not sure how far that goes, but it's better than no revenue.
If you didn't have that contract right now, it would be demonstrably worse. So that's very good news. I used to know this in my head. I don't now, but the state contract was multiples of 10%, 30, 40% of the revenue of the system. So having that as kind of a ballast is good to know.
Yeah. So that, and I don't know, because these are numbers now, how far that revenue provides in terms of the waterfall. Does that get you, for example, past the entire Series A into the second step, which was, let me look at my little table, my little cheat sheet here. So after the Series A bonds, you go into the operating fund, and then after the operating fund, you go into Series B and C. So I'm not sure how far that revenue alone gets you down, but it might get you pretty far, because obviously that's an important revenue source.
Yeah. So Rita Kelly, I don't know if John Gass is still the asset manager for Park Harris.
Yes, he is, and he provides a quarterly report to me.
Yeah, so that's something that would answer Jeffrey's question. I'd be happy to take a look at it, but without having seen any of these for 2 years and seen none since COVID, I don't know, what that looks like, but he should be, as he did, when we worked together, Marita, providing you, for your quarterly report, an update on revenues versus budget, expenses versus budget, and how much.
It is updated and it is in the report. Mhm.
Okay. Did that just get filed, or is it about to get filed?
No, it was filed on October 8th.
Okay.
Let's see if I can find the page number. I'm looking at it right now.
I used to read it the day it came out, but not anymore.
Good, thank you for that. That's important, because obviously we want, one of the questions that this entire discussion was, what was the scheme, and then how would COVID change? And obviously having the revenue from DJS is great, because even though there will be an impact from other lost revenue, that does mean there's a substantial amount of revenue that's still coming into the scheme.
Right. So
Jeffrey, I would note that I think from our informals, it won't hit the whole nut there for next year, or maybe it won't hit it cash flow wise. There'll be a point where there is some need for participation by the A bondholders, but that's just sort of general discussion at the moment.
Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting.
Do you know whether they have had to dip into the reserve funds, and whether there's any debt service reserve fund? That's supposed to be 1 year's worth of debt service.
So they had to pay part of the money based on money on hand. And I don't think they were explicit that it was debt service in the report I saw. But in June, there was an interest payment due, and there wasn't enough flow to pay it at that point.
Yeah.
Interest and principal are both coming due in 2021, which was not what was going on this year, I think just by design. But this is going to be a problem that every stakeholder sits down and has a conversation about, Steve, as we've talked about.
Yeah.
It's no one's fault that this happened. It's a pandemic. And the question is, what will the solutions be, to sort of mend it, to get it to the point where it's working again. But those discussions, will be ongoing, and it's a problem to work through at the end of the day.
Yeah. Yeah. And you can't even really come up with a solution until you know when COVID ends and what the world's going to look like then, because you could come up with, what you think, and it's not going to be that. But this is going to go across this is going to go on across the country in parking and a lot of other revenue transactions. It's going to be like a restructuring negotiation, I think. You've got to, you're going to be thinking about if, so many less people are parking, should we close some of these parking garages and, consolidate our operations, reduce expenses and, sell the, these off. We're going to, maybe have to restructure some bonds, restructure, how we fund capital. It's something to kind of, expect, but, and think about now, but I really don't think that until you see what the new normal is on the other side of COVID, you're going to have the tools to build the mousetrap you need.
Thank you, Steve, for explaining that to us. And I'm sure there's a couple other questions that people might have in the room.
You're welcome.
I have a question, just in the simplest terms. The city doesn't have any form of guarantee that they've provided, correct? So the city receives payments out of the system, but as you were saying in the beginning, in a downturn like this, the city is not one of the guarantors, so it doesn't have the downside risk other than the loss of some of the payments to which it's beneficial.
Correct.
Steve, a question if you can answer about the bondholders, the Series A bondholders. Do you have any idea who are these bondholders? What kind of entities are they?
I did, and I think that PEDFA, at my request, received a book of who bought all the bonds. It's going to be a mix of institutions like your Vanguards and your Fidelities and Oppenheimer and some high net worth individuals. Quite frankly, Guggenheim was the underwriter, Guggenheim Securities, and we were about 85 million short, and they took it into inventory and they were going to sell it off over time. By now, I'm sure, they sold it off, but what I would suggest, if you want to know that, and at some point, the creditors and the credit enhancers are going to probably want to know that, is that somebody get in touch with someone in Steve Drizos' office in PetFocus. He's got the book. Now, also know that people don't trade debt like they trade stocks, but bonds do trade. So one could go on Emma, which is the municipal site that tracks these things, and see if bonds have traded. So even the book from 2013 is going to need some updating because some of the funds and some of the individuals will have traded.
Thank you for that. Last question, variation on the one I had asked a moment ago. And Neil, I don't know if you have an opinion about this, or Steve, you have an opinion about this. One of the things we're talking about is rebuilding the city's credit rating to regain access to credit markets. Does the performance of the parking system have any direct effect on that?
You broke up a little bit at the end. Does the what of the parking system?
Does the performance of the parking system, do you think that has a direct effect on the efforts that I know the city's making to build up its creditworthiness to regain access to credit markets?
It's a great question, and Neil, it's kind of in my area, so if you want to chime in, you should feel free. But typically, the credit of the city would be a product of the kinds of things that Marita was talking about. How's your revenue doing? It's a little slow this year, but our EIT is not off 25%, and we thought it would be. Our business privilege tax isn't off 20%. We thought it would be. So, it's doing pretty well. It's the amount of debt you have outstanding versus your expenses, the debt versus the revenues, your management capabilities, things like that. This is not debt of the city, indirect or direct, and therefore it should have little or no impact on the city's rating, other than if somebody says, well, Harrisburg parking bonds have defaulted if that were to happen, or the insurer had to pay on it, you'd have that, what we would call kind of headline impact. But I think they're called the PEDFA bonds. So maybe the state has that headline impact concern.
And I will note, and Steve, this is sort of a follow-up to a discussion the board had about a month ago. After I left, we were talking about the city's credit rating. And what had slipped my mind is the discussions we'd had, which are all informal, so you can't really rely and say they're absolutely so, was that the folks on the borrowing side for public debt were very much aware of the uncertainty of the city's actual long-term taxing ability. And that to them was the primary factor of getting back into the market when that stabilized into a permanent state. There's some other stuff available, but to really move back into what I would consider a normal municipal entity in not just for Pennsylvania, but across the country that can borrow in the regular market and issue bonds and guarantees, they want, a stabilization on the legal side so it's predictable when they sell the bonds, what type of tax base we actually have and what the rates we're entitled to are. And that's sort of, that was one of the drivers when we were lobbying to get a change in Act 47 status that ultimately ended up in Act 124.
Yeah, I could say that in 2011 and 12, we were thinking about, the rehabilitation of the city's credit rating, and we had ideas about it then. But as Neil pointed out, one thing is not adding too much debt and having that declining, and the most important thing was a reliable tax revenue base, because that's what cities pledge, their geo taxes. So if it were the fact that the tripled EIT was going to have to go away, we were trying to backfill it so that there was some steadiness. If the city has the EIT and the LST in its tax base, and it's not something that can be taken away by legislation or otherwise, then that could be counted on. If there's some risk to that as its tax base, that's going to be a major credit issue.
Thank you so much. The last one is just some thoughts. I'm not in the form of a question, but the performance of the parking system, after all, is very important to the economic health of the city. Parking, especially when it comes to downtown, which generates substantial more amount of tax revenues for the city. The interrelatedness of the parking system and the city's ability to perform economic development are closely related. So I think the city obviously benefits from the cash flow year to year, but also from the prospects of economic development in the long term. So,
yeah, I totally agree. And you've got that 20% taxes, $3 million a year, but much more importantly is the success of businesses, economic development, things like that. And so I thought that you were asking me whether if there was a downgrade on the parking bonds themselves, that would be a credit negative. But what comes out of this in terms of all of the things that you just said are absolutely positively important for the well-being of the city, and the well-being of the city has a direct impact on its credit.
Any other questions for Steve? There are a lot of puzzle pieces. I think they're slightly sharper in our mind at this point. So hopefully we can begin to put it back together. I do love your analogy that none of the debt holders wanted to get a haircut. I thought that was pretty good.
We weren't even allowed to say that word.
Oh, so thank you, Steve, very much. And I hope you'll indulge us if we have any questions afterwards. We will be in touch.
Anytime. Thank you.
And at some point when we can get you back here, I'll treat you for lunch somewhere.
Okay. Sounds good.
All right. Thank you. At this point, Jeffrey, I was going to ask you for a quick update You attended the audit committee meeting for the city of Harrisburg, and you were just going to give us a quick
Yeah,
where we
so
were.
yeah, just a word. No surprise, the 2019 audit is not yet completed. So the original deadline for the city to complete the 2019 audit has passed. And they did release a statement, which is part of the official missing of the deadline, which was placed in Emma, as Steve mentioned Emma before, because they're required by the SEC filing to meet a certain deadline. Saying that because of circumstances, both in terms of, as we know, the loss of the finance director did set them back, as well as changing audit firms, which is a very common thing to set back a municipality in its production of an audit, as well as the fact that COVID has added to extra accounting responsibilities in the city, that they have missed the initial deadline. It is still the hope of the new auditor to have the 2019 audit completed and presented to the city and to the audit committee and to the ICA before the end of the current calendar year. They are working diligently on that. And I will say that the point person for the city is Brian McCutcheon, which we all know. And Brian is able to put some effort into that now. They have made a tremendous amount of progress throughout the year. And they've also engaged the previous auditor to help them with a couple of parts of the audit, which has really helped speed things along. And so there is a belief that it will be coming shortly. Unfortunately, this is a very busy time of year for other things. We do have coming up very shortly the city's operating budget for the 2021 fiscal year. So everything is going to sort of hit simultaneously. The chair already mentioned that the mayor's 5-year fiscal plan is coming up this week. So there's going to be a lot of documents that are going to happen sort of simultaneously. But one of the things that was discussed is potentially a joint meeting with the audit committee and the ICA board together to go over the audit and hear from the auditor on findings, as opposed to 2 separate meetings, because that might speed the process along at this point. So there is a belief that that is forthcoming, and we should get something from the auditor and the audit committee shortly. The audit committee is not scheduled to meet until December of 2020. They will, however, have a special meeting before that, or special meetings before that, if the audit is actually completed sooner than December, which is certainly the hope. So I don't know if that answers any questions on the subject, but it is still forthcoming.
That's a great quick update to know what additional work there is out there upcoming. We now move to other business. And I know Neil has some updates that he was going to share relative to some of the good news, I think, on the finance front.
And I thank you, Audrey. I think a lot of it has now been covered. We got the CARES Act money, the $2.8 million, and the commitment on the parking letter from DGS. I will note that's a letter that is described as annual. We've never seen one before. And so I don't know if it's a new practice that they're doing, but we were happy to get the notification of what the commitment was. I wanted to comment a little bit on Marita's number of the 55.94% versus, I think, closer to 70 on where we are, because at least in my lens, we're a little better than it seems, in that $8 million of our revenues and general funds for 2020 were intergovernmental funds. And the slowdown, if we had gotten that, we'd be past the 70%, which is the state's money. We don't have the 5/12 yet. I double checked with that today. It still hasn't arrived. The paperwork went in, and we had just gotten at the very end of September, the $3.1 million for the pensions, which is intergovernmental funds that, at least as I understand them as intergovernmental funds, which would put us close to, where we should be. So in some ways we're surprised. I think everybody in some ways is, we've done well with the EIT, we've done well with the LST, and because real estate taxes or prices are going up, we're doing not bad on the transfer taxes. We're still waiting for data, but the numbers, we're having a very robust transfer of real estate in 2020 in the city in terms of the marketplace. That doesn't mean that we can predict 2021 will be that robust. We will start seeing some of the consequences as we go forward. We had to, just like the county did and others did, we waived certain penalties through the end of the year to pay bills, which were part of the budgeted money to come in on certain taxes and fees. And we won't really see the business privilege tax consequence till next year when they start filing on April 15th, for what 2020 was for them. So there are things we look at and realize that, we're trying to be conservative about what will happen with those. I will report progress on, we had talked about this, I think Charlie talked about AMBAC, on the ongoing negotiations with AMBAC. We expect to be close very soon. There have been very positive discussions. I can't do the details of them yet because it wouldn't be fair to AMBAC or others, but we are very optimistic about where the other side of that will be for the city, both in the immediate term and the long term. So, but they have been in good faith at the table with us. I will note today, because we signed the document today, we just settled the dispute over the Public Works building, which has been a long pending dispute for about $725,000. That was a dispute that started for various reasons, including some of the physical issues at the property and whose responsibilities they were. But we did have a mediation with the court and resolve that, which is a good item to get behind us at this point. But Jeffrey is correct. We are about as busy a time of a year we're going to ever get as right now. I got a final notice today, which is usually the last step of the audit process, comes to the Law Bureau. And we got that notification that they were ready to stand there. We just don't know because it's a new auditor, whether it's their last step. It was always the other auditor's last step. But that would trigger the last bit of reporting that they would plug into the audit and then issue. So it looks like we're on track for November, unless they have a different order of events that they're using. We have been told that I think we're not going to anticipate getting waterfall payments from the parking system for 2021. I mean, that's not a shock to us, but again, it's a problem to work through, not just for us. I think we have developed a fairly solid partnership with the principals on that. We look at the AGM has sort of invested in the city in a way by guaranteeing bonds for a number of things, including the Verizon Tower and for the parking system. And, the mayor has worked a good negotiation relationship with them. And, we will be meeting with them in due course to talk about the future. I think everyone recognizes the system was working well right up until everything sort of closed. And we expect to find a way, not alone, but with many others, to sort of come to a solution to these problems. But I think Steve references, it's everywhere. It's not just us. Everyone has this problem. I personally don't believe the Commonwealth is going to let itself default on a whole series of bonds for a whole series of things. And so there's going to be partially some solution that comes out of the state. We just don't know what it's going to be. And we expect it'll affect part of this. We just don't know what part of it. But we don't have control over that. We wait for the news of what they're going to do. We don't know whether we will get the other 7th, 12th commitment when they come back for a budget in November or not. And that's the same boat I think everyone else is in, across the state. And that they have a tough problem in front of them, and they have hard decisions to make in a very short period of time. But we're very cognizant of it. They've been drilling in a lot here. Mark Woolley, the mayor, Brian, and others have been with Dan Connolly, our financial advisor, have been drilling in pretty deeply on the numbers and working to get to a fair projection of where we're going. And I'm happy to answer any questions you may have, Audrey, or anyone else along those lines.
Well, can I ask a question, Audrey? Neil, is there any updated status and performance of the Neighborhood Services Fund, which is accounted for separately than the general fund? How's that holding up over the last 3 months or so since we last got an update on it?
So I think I heard you, but you're breaking up a little bit. You're asking about the Neighborhood Services Fund and how it's performing?
Yes, please. Since our last update, I think it was from the previous quarter.
Yeah, and I don't keep such things on the top of my head. I will note that in some ways, there, and maybe you have seen this, we did a 2-month credit over last 4 months of the years for applications for commercial accounts. But we're hitting our numbers at the incinerator, which we need to hit in terms of volume. We're constantly working on other ways to do the collections, for some of the more open questions. The audit identified a problem potentially in how they were counting the 12-month period in the past, which I know they're working through in finance and may require a restatement. And I frankly don't know if they're saying it's an overstatement or understatement the way they did it. I will let the finance guys figure that part out. But we have been going full tilt on things in terms of picking up both commercial. We haven't had a huge drop off. We had a couple large accounts like a hotels who went from 5 days a week to 1 day a week and things like that. But and that's not unexpected. The school district went from 7 days a week or 6 days a week to pretty much almost nothing. And those are a big account for the city. And I think we're still working through what that's going to mean long term.
Neil, question for you, a little bit in the weeds. I know this when the city signed on neighboring municipality Steelton as a sort of, would you call it a client of the neighborhood services division? Does that count towards the city's requirement as far as tonnage that must deliver to the incinerator?
I don't think so, but I would have to double check. I knew the answer to that at one point, but I just don't remember the answer to that. I will note the city is involved in a couple other negotiations for other intergovernmental cooperation agreements that there's been some public meetings on, also related to neighborhood services. So we're optimistic we'll be able to solidify those, but that's going to take the agreement of a number of parties to do that.
Sounds great.
Steelton, I think we're collecting at a rate, it's something like 92% on-time payment out of Steelton, which has to do with how they're structured. It's just residential, it's not commercial, but that has been a solid intergovernmental agreement for us in terms of solidifying, both the idea of cooperation regionally, and stabilizing things like neighborhood services.
Yeah, it'd be good to see those numbers at some point if we could see a summary. And then also if there are lessons to be learned that maybe we can apply them to the collection problem that we want to continue to better in the city.
Yeah, that was going to be my question too. I would love to see at this point, given the time that the agreement's been in effect, I'd love to see sort of a P&L for the Steelton cooperation agreement and see how it's performing financially for the city's neighborhood services fund. It'd be really interesting.
I don't think we do P&Ls as a government entity, but I think there's some.
Sorry, as a manner of speech. Yeah.
Right. I will see what they have in terms of that. They look at those very hard because the determination you have to make is it we are not going to use the taxpayer money of the city of Harrisburg for that service. It's got to be self-sufficient to do it. And it is my understanding we are there. There was some anticipation of early cost, like getting them into the billing system and doing those things, which is all running now. The initial charges for things like trash cans for each property owner. And so that under the 5-year structure was built to be on the front end of it. But I can get you what is there. I think that's more of a detailed presentation just because it is the weeds to get to separate it out. In sanitation, government's its own thing. We have a different obligation in Harrisburg because we provide our own than we do if you're servicing a separate municipality. They can cite their households over there for not paying their bill because we don't have to pick up their trash. It is very hard because we're in charge of public health and safety for the city for us to leave trash because that we're already billing them for it and we're not supposed to penalize them twice. so we can add a late charge, and that's the penalty, for late payment. We're not supposed to then penalize them and give them a codes violation, which is the structural difference of serving another entity. And that has been sort of one of the puzzles trying to solve. How do you incentivize on-time payment in a more aggressive way? And they've tried a couple different things, everything from dunning letters to some civil suits, trying to find the right mix. And ultimately, I think it's probably going to be in the lien system is where it's going to rest. I think that's where it's going to ultimately be, is devoting money to the lien system, which secures the payment, even if it's not immediately paid. And then it's coming up with the right formula. You don't want to lien a property every year for $400, for someone not paying, but you don't want to let them go 3 years either. So.
And I know that, and I apologize for that call. I know Kathy has a question and Doug has a question. So maybe if we take them in that order.
Okay. Neil, are you at liberty to let us know whether or not the $725,000 in the settlement for the public works building is a lump sum or whether it's over time?
It's a lump sum. It's out of there was a reallocation. It's out of the neighborhood services fund that it's coming out of, because it's for that. There is still a just compensation dispute, which is not unexpected by the property owner in the eminent domain context. And both sides have issued appraisals related to that. And we are hoping to resolve that as well, but we couldn't resolve both at the same time. We did not have the other appraisal at the time we went to the mediation on the question about taxes and rents and things like that.
Okay, thank you.
The check's in my hand in my office today, so.
Thanks.
Returning briefly to the Steelton question. So do I understand it correctly then that the city direct bills the Steelton residents? And is the borough involved in any way?
Borough is involved in helping us with enforcement.
On the liens then?
Code side. Like if we don't pick up your trash, then you get a code citation because your trash is out on the sidewalk because you're supposed to be getting it picked up. So it's not a bad system. You just can't do it in your own town.
Yeah, I understand that. Yeah. So, well, when you reference the lien then, though, that's City of Harrisburg filing the lien.
Harrisburg filing liens against City of Harrisburg properties. That Municipal Liens Act really is what is on the books, on secured over the long term. Okay. It's very, very aggressive in its language, and it has a very long shelf life.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? If not, thank you, Neil, and we'll move to the public comment if any have been received, Jeffrey.
I do have the one that we received overnight, but I have nothing additional today during the meeting. So if you want, I could just respond to putting that one into the record.
I think that would be great.
Okay, so please stand by. I'm going to read this. This was comments that were received overnight from Mr. Eric Epstein, and I'm going to respond to them into the record. Number one, please provide a summary of the status as well as expenses, invoices, and updates on the litigation involving the ICA. So the response to that one is that litigation is ongoing. There has been no action on the case in recent months. There has been one expense dated today for $3,426.35, and that was to the insurance company legal counsel. I'm going to try to get their name right. It's PGABR. That's the name of the law firm. And that was a payment that was provided today. And I will provide Mr. Epstein with a copy of the cover pages for those invoices. That was number one. Number two, he asked a question, has the ICA communicated with Senator Costa regarding the appointment of the new ICA member? And if so, can you provide copies of that correspondence? There has been one letter and 2 emails, and I will provide Mr. Epstein with copies of that correspondence. He asked if there had been any correspondence between the ICA and Mr. Dan Miller, and I can tell him there's been no correspondence between the ICA and Mr. Miller, so there's nothing to provide there. He noted that in the last ICA meeting, this is number 4, Ms. Carter noted that the city had issued their 2020 mid-year financial report and members of the board had reviewed it, that Mr. Woolley was unable to attend the meeting and that questions were submitted to Mr. Woolley and he had responded. And he had asked if he could have a copy of that response from Mr. Woolley, as well as the comments that were made from Charlie and Bill at the controller's office. The response from Mr. Woolley is in writing. It is a document and it will be provided through the right to know process. The comments from Charlie and Bill at the controller's office were verbal, and so there's no document to provide Mr. Epstein in response to their comments. Then he asked, as sort of 4B, please provide the responses to the questions that were submitted as well as thoughts. And there were no written record of the thoughts that were provided relative to the 2020 mid-year financial report. So there's no document there to provide. Question number 5 from Mr. Epstein. The second category of debt is the money that the AMBAC loaned to the city to make debt payments. They stepped in as insurance company. He said the rate on that debt is 6.75% and the city has not made payments and that the AMBAC debt has risen to $25 million. His first question is, can the rate interest rate be negotiated? And could I please provide a summary of the debt expansion that raised it to $25 million? And my response to Mr. Epstein is that this is a question for the city of Harrisburg, and therefore it should be asked to the city rather than the Commonwealth. The ICA is a Commonwealth agency and the debt is held by the city of Harrisburg. And therefore I don't have the ability to answer his question. He did ask, however, is there a final agreement between the city and AMBAC? And if so, can he have a copy? We heard today that there is not a final agreement. And in the future, he should ask that question to the city of Harrisburg. Once again, AMBAC and the city have the relationship. The ICA is not a party to that relationship. And then the final question sent overnight from Mr. Epstein is there a shared vision of the city of Harrisburg and the ICA? And to that question, I am asking him to please refer to the mission and priority statement, which is currently available on the ICA website, www.hbgica.org. And that concludes our public comments for today.
Thank you, Jeffrey. It's the first time in 3 meetings, I think. And if there is nothing else that anyone wants to bring forth at this time, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
A second?
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? We are officially adjourned and we will be back together on November 18th. And it will likely be a Zoom meeting again, but you'll get confirmation of that as soon as we can finalize that. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Audrey. Thanks, everyone.
Be well.
Thank you. So long, everyone.
Don't forget to vote.
Who did that?
Already did.
5:20 p.m. by the way. And yes, election day is Tuesday.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.